Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you here to this, the third so far of the Labour Studies seminar. These seminars are run by the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit in partnership with economics and economic history and sociology and industrial sociology. And just to introduce the series, if you're new to it, essentially we look at labour studies in the broader sense. So we cover everything from labour history to crunching numbers on the size of the informal sector to discussions of policy challenges, labour movements, strikes, a wide range of things. So it's a very Catholic understanding of labour studies. We're also happy here to be hosting someone who has been closely associated with NALSU, somebody who did her studies partly through NALSU support, and somebody we're very proud to be associated with. Siviwe Mhlana is a researcher at the Southern Centre for Inequalities Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. She completed her Masters in Social Policy and Labour Studies at the ISER, in which NALSU was then located. And her Masters explored the changing nature of labour-intensive production in post-apartheid South Africa and the gendered individualization of risk associated with non-standard, informal, and precarious employment. She also got a Bachelor of Economics, a Bachelor of Economics Honours, also from Rhodes. She works as a consultant for the International Women's Health Coalition, and WeGo. She serves currently on the board of the Institute for Economic Justice. She's a research associate in Rhodes' Department of Economics and Economic History, and a member of the NALSU team. So I'm not going to talk too much about what Siviwe's paper is going to deal with. Siviwe will, of course, speak to the main points, but the main thing is we're looking here at reimagining the global economy, alternative visions for an equitable and sustainable post-COVID-19 economic recovery. Look, it's obviously that COVID's had huge negative effects on many people, that the inequalities and suffering that already exist in society have been exacerbated by, but also reflect the impact of COVID. And we can see it in a wide range of ways. For example, South African social protection has almost no coverage for self-employed people and for many of the precarious employed. If we look at who lost their jobs, it's not going to be, for the most part, people like university professors or members of parliament. Parliament was closed for months and nobody actually noticed. So it's really people at the front line here. So if society has already got these severe problems of inequality, suffering, exploitation going on, maybe we shouldn't waste the crisis. Maybe this offers an opportunity to reboot our trajectory as a society, as an economy, and as humanity in the world today. So without further ado, I'm going to give it over to Siviwe. Just noting a comment from Mike Rogan saying he is not a member of parliament. That is true. I specifically voted against you, even though you weren't running. Siviwe, the floor, so to speak, is yours. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making yourself available. We will run the talk, you can do about 30, 40 minutes. We're flexible, and then we'll take bunches of questions, both from online participants and from people in the house here. So thanks very much, and it's your time.
Thanks, Lucian, and thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so this project really began at the start of 2021, having, witnessed and studied really what Lucian was speaking to around the unevenness of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the unevenness of measures for recovery, but also out of the realization that the kind of current global economic model was inadequate for addressing the multiple crises that developing countries in the global south in particular had been facing. So we'd seen with the pandemic, hundreds of millions of people being infected, and the coronavirus claiming the lives of nearly 6.8 6.3 million people to date. We've seen the kind of significant impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has had, particularly on the global economy, with a 4.3 contraction in GDP in 2020, the falling of global FDIs, rising food prices, rising food insecurity, but also around the impacts that this has had on work in particular, with an equivalent of 225 million full-time jobs being recorded to have been lost during the kind of global shutdown and lockdown period. What the pandemic has also highlighted, as we know, is that really the kind of vulnerability and the risks of the pandemic, have been influenced by, race, gender, income levels, the sectors of the economy, and really that this hasn't been, unbiased in the vulnerability, and that in particular low and middle income countries were most affected in terms of job losses, but also again, as I've mentioned, that this has been something, the kind of crisis has been in particular gendered, and that young people have also been affected in particular. In regards to gender, we've seen that women and the informal economy, I think feminist economists always refer to women as being the kind of cushions and shock absorbers in times of crisis. And so this has largely been around the fact that, the ILO reports that about 70% of the global health, women make up about 70% of the health and social service sectors around the world, but also we've seen with the 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy, that it was women that were more likely to be in vulnerable jobs, even within the informal economy, that lack kind of social protections. We've also seen studies showing the kind of uneven distribution of kind of the care work that has taken place in households as countries have been trying to quell the spread of the coronavirus. But in speaking to the kind of unevenness that I mentioned in regard to the measures for recovery, the IMF reported that, kind of 16.9 trillion of the global stimulus that was allocated for fiscal support, that only 13.8 and 0.4% was allocated to emerging market and developing economies in particular. And we've seen that as countries have now begun moving towards recovery, that we're seeing this kind of significant differentiation when it comes to high-income countries and EMDEs, with high-income countries being able to begin recovering a large proportion of the jobs that were lost as emerging market and developing economies continue to kind of suffer the losses, the job losses that have resulted from this pandemic. So this definitely does suggest an urgent need for, kind of global economic policies that are not only aimed at kind of mitigating the immediate impacts of the crisis, but also at ensuring, recovering livelihoods, but also fostering economies that are resilient and equitable and sustainable in the long run. But having kind of looked at the international discussions about a post-COVID-19 recovery, it's also important to consider economic policy that are context-specific and that are targeted to kind of meet the needs of the most vulnerable members of society, some of which I've already mentioned, in particular women and workers in the informal economy. So the kind of objectives of this project were really to kind of analyze the economic policies that were being presented at an international level, and to determine the extent to which each of these kind of recovery policy plans reflected issues, particularly in the global south, and then to also identify the kind of policies that are required to improve livelihoods and build resilient economies in these contexts based on the perspectives of activists and experts in the global south. And really, the objective of that was really having seen that kind of the international discussion about a post-COVID-19 economy had kind of excluded perspectives from the global south, whilst at the same time we'd seen a kind of disproportionate impact on these economies and communities in particular. So as I've mentioned, I reviewed several policy proposals at an international level, but based on the kind of framing of the kind of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and to kind of see, what kinds of policies are being proposed in terms of protecting livelihoods, promoting gender equality, boosting employment, advancing efforts towards a green transition, and strengthening macroeconomic policies and frameworks. And then again, as I've mentioned, to position then the perspectives of experts and activists and policymakers in the global South by identifying potential pathways based on what they observe as being the key challenges that are facing these economies. So this was also then kind of framed within the context of the global macroeconomic landscape. And so without getting into detail about the kind of broader issues, and to just kind of highlight the key issues that we're facing, these economies in particular, were issues around rising debt levels. So we saw that as part of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was that the global debt reached 99% of global GDP at the end of 2020, but that there were also increasing debt vulnerabilities, but in particular in regard to low and middle income countries, that this has been something that had been happening for 10 years before the pandemic. And a large issue, or at least the main challenge, or suggest that has been suggested that the biggest issue around rising debt levels for low and middle income countries could be attributed to obviously growing dependence of low income countries on borrowing on external debt financing, which is usually denominated obviously with a foreign currency, and then with that depreciating national currencies or appreciating foreign currencies, and rapidly rising interest payments. And so there is a big need then to kind of rethink the international development finance system. And it's been suggested that progressive macroeconomic policies, debt transparency, as well as obviously regulating the kind of international financial system is critical for achieving an inclusive post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And then in regard to kind of the state of global tax, we know that there, kind of about 427 billion United States dollars is lost to tax abuses every year, that 98% of these international tax abuses are due to high income countries, but also that a lot of it, I think about up to 650 billion United States dollars is lost to tax havens in the global north in particular. But at the same time as, kind of low income countries being responsible for less than 2% of these global tax abuses, they are the most vulnerable to the kind of effects of this. So we see that, for instance, low-income economies account for nearly 200 billion in lost tax revenues each year. But also when we consider the amount of tax revenues that are collected by these countries, that the kind of impact is much more significant. African economies in particular are vulnerable to corporate tax abuses. UNCTAD reports that 1/10 of corporate tax revenues earned by African economies is lost to tax avoidance, but also a global level analyses indicate that between 20 and 30%, approximately 500 billion of private wealth in African countries is held in offshore tax havens. So this, when we're thinking about kind of the fiscal restraints on African economies or economies in the global south in particular, we have to consider that a lot of the kind of financing for recovery is being lost, definitely through kind of illicit financial flows, but also as the State of Tax Justice reports, lower income countries lose an equivalent of 52% of their health budgets in taxes compared to about 8.4% in higher income countries. So something to consider when we're talking about increasing access to social protections and social services. And then without getting into too much detail here, as countries are pushing, this idea of a green transition, addressing issues around climate change, it's important to note again that the impacts of the climate crisis are definitely disproportionately borne again by countries in the global south in regards to kind of food security, in regards to the implications that this has on work. And so this is a big issue as well when we kind of think of the situation, when we think about the situation in regards to the climate crisis, but also at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic has been happening. So what kinds of policies then have been proposed at an international level? So in particular, in reviewing these policies, I really prioritized the kind of policies or the international discussions that would have the biggest influence. And we've seen this even in our kind of a budget in South Africa, in the kind of national economic recovery policy plans in developing countries, that a lot of these had been influenced by the kind of the conditionalities of the IMF, on the kind of policy proposals from the World Bank, from the UN, etc. And so if we review, as I've said, based on the kind of sustainable development goals, the kinds of policies that were being promoted to protect and improve livelihoods, there was obviously an awareness that there is a need for social protections to save lives in the medium term and to kind of protect livelihoods going forward. But of course, this was also looked at as kind of short-term measures while promoting that, governments should do this. And there's a difference between the kind of discussions and rhetoric that's being put out and what you actually then see when it comes to the kind of national economic recovery plan. So at the same time as we're saying that there's a need for increasing access to social protections, we also see that, kind of IMF and World Bank pushing, this idea of fiscal consolidation, which would then result obviously in kind of reduced spending in these specific services that we're saying need to be expanded in terms of access to people. And then again, in terms of promoting gender equality, if you look at the kind of mainstream policy proposals, it's always looked at in terms of kind of traditionally formal sector jobs. So supporting kind of feminized industries in that sense. But at the same time, I'll say that despite there being evidence of the kind of gendered trends and the vulnerability of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I've mentioned, in terms of women's roles in the health and services sectors, women in the informal economy in particular, but also studies showing increased gender-based violence, but as well as the kind of increasing or deepening of the feminization of poverty as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Very little of the kind of mainstream policies have really considered the kinds of policies that are required to protect women and girls in the medium to long term, but also to kind of support the very sectors that women and girls, sectors that women are more likely to be engaged in. And then in regards to boosting employment, again, in the short term, there were a lot of calls to kind of, in terms of the kind of fiscal support to support industries, and then in particular looking more into the long term, a lot of support and prioritization of small and micro enterprises. I will say though, and as part of another project that we're working on, with WeGo is that there are kind of critiques on whether or not this kind of targeting towards SMMEs would be likely to, say, reach own account workers or contributing family workers. And that, you know, there are calls for, and I'll get into more detail in this, calls for kind of other measures that would more directly support workers in the informal economy, which we know that developing countries in the global south are, you know, most people are more likely, a large proportion of the informal economy is more likely to be found in. And then again, without getting into too much detail with this green transition, if you look at the mainstream policies, it's definitely focused more on kind of increasing investments in green infrastructure, sustainable technologies, etc. So as I've mentioned that, you know, one of the main objectives of this was to then position the kind of perspectives from the global south in these kind of broader international discussions about what exactly would a green, just and sustainable economic recovery look like from the perspectives of developing countries in the global south. And to also identify what the kind of key issues are that need to be addressed for us to actually achieve this inclusive economic recovery for all. And so the kind of common issues that, you know, interviews revealed were that common issues in developing countries were issues of poverty, inequality, precarity, climate change, as I've mentioned, insufficient access to social protections, as Lucien also mentioned earlier, and a constrained fiscal space. But also that there were persistent legacies, colonial legacies, and the unequal inclusion of Southern countries in the global financial system that pose significant limitations on the kind of resources that these countries had to adequately respond to the crisis. In regards to poverty, inequality, and precarity, we know that emerging and developing economies face high levels of unemployment, but also that that they also represent the majority of the world's informal economy. But also with the kind of measures that were implemented by governments to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the working poor were not able to access their work, resulting in joblessness and a lack of income. And there's a really important study that Saldru did in the start of the pandemic, which also showed that you know, kind of these precarious workers who were already, you know, in kind of low paid and insecure jobs, as a result of the kind of lockdown measures, were also unable to access the kind of informal safety nets. But also interviews revealed, of course, rising food insecurity in many countries due to reduced earnings and school closures. And we know this specifically in the global south. Insufficient access to social protection. Interviews revealed that indigenous communities and those that were living in rural areas faced continuous challenges to accessing social services during the pandemic. And that, as I've mentioned, due to the large numbers of the informal economy and the nature of the informal economy itself, a lot of people lacked access to work-based social protections such as medical aid or health insurance. And there was also increasing concern about the growing divide between the North and South. I talked about the kind of allocation of the fiscal support, but also, as we've seen, even with the provision of vaccines in countries. And so the divide between Northern and Southern countries and the kinds of services that communities were able to access to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. And then we've talked about debt, but an important finding from the interviews were that a number of factors that were currently disadvantaging developing countries, this is from the IEJ, was that you know, high borrowing costs, unequal access to credit, and restrictive conditions that were imposed by international financial institutions. And then, as I've mentioned, that the concern that, mainstream or multilateral organizations are pushing this idea of fiscal consolidation, and that this may lead to reduced spending on the kind of necessary functions for protecting lives and livelihoods in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And then, based on that, I wanted to also explore the kinds of policies that were required then. So we've seen what the tax reform looks like when we look at the mainstream policies. It's really about expanding the tax base, but not really getting into what the issue with taxes are in these countries. And so from the perspectives of activists and experts in the Global South, there is a need for, kind of proposals for instituting a wealth tax, but also developing more progressive policies on taxation to increase revenue, and really kind of taking a look at international taxation rules and amending them to address the issue of illicit financial flows, which I also mentioned earlier. And then protecting lives and livelihoods, we've seen obviously kind of the hoops that people had to jump over, even in South Africa, in order to access the cash transfers. So in the kind of short and medium term, there were definitely calls for kind of ensuring that these kind of measures were accessible to people irrespective of employment, but also looking at kind of what the kinds of oversight that are required to ensure that workers' rights are protected and enforced. And also, again, we've seen ongoing discussions around universal basic income, but in particular, looking at the kinds of interventions that are also required to recognize and support the informal economy through a blended pool of finance, a combination of grants, capital, and equity that women informal workers could easily access, because many studies have showed that that is a big challenge as well. And then in regard to a green transition, and I think this was one of the interesting conversations that I had in doing this study. So there's definitely consensus. As I've mentioned, the climate crisis greatly affects kind of developing countries in the Global South, but I think then the kind of the disjuncture between mainstream policy proposals and what is happening in the Global South was around what would this actually look like? What does a green, just, and sustainable economy look like from the perspective of the Global South? And from the perspective of indigenous people in the Global South as well in particular. And so there's really a big concern among activists that the kind of mainstream policies for a green economy that are being pushed will lead to further environmental destruction, corporate capture, and the continued exploitation of kind of indigenous land territories and resources. And so activists believe that in order to kind of for a kind of green, just, and sustainable economy to be truly realized, there is a need for a radical redistribution and restructuring of the current global economic system, and that this will require a fundamental shift in the narratives that have historically deprived communities of control over their own resources, and the centering of indigenous people and communities as the main beneficiaries of any advancements towards a green economy. And so there's several kind of proposals that have been offered here, whether it's proposals around land redistribution and reform, whether it's investing in agriculture and agro-processing, investing in skilling of youth around these kind of sectors in particular that many developing countries I've mentioned rely on in terms of employment, etc. But also experts believe that countries should consider a few things in determining whether pathways are appropriate for achieving a green, just and sustainable economy in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And these include, how can a green transition improve the livelihoods of the poor and those working in the formal economy in particular who have been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? And how could a green transition lead to a more equitable distribution of incomes and the development of production systems that are more sustainable, local, and environmentally friendly? But also, how could a green transition create sustainable jobs that are able to absorb the large numbers of unemployed and those working in the informal economy? And there are several promising strategies that are already being implemented by civil society organizations in the global south, and promising strategies that are also being proposed by kind of experts and activists in the global south. And these include addressing inequality by incorporating social policies into economic policies. So these are not seen as two separate things. Defending the rights of workers in the informal economy and the kind of legal and economic recognition of work in the informal economy, building alliances, promoting social dialogue and advocacy that includes reporting to these treaty bodies and international agencies, and identifying common interests for the protection of social and environmental rights, building capacities, product diversification, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, with home-based workers switching up their production towards essential goods such as personal protective equipment, and of course reskilling workers to match the skills that will be required in the future. And then finally, to conclude, so as I mentioned, the main objective was to position the perspectives of activists and experts in the global south in these international discussions about a post-COVID-19 economic recovery. We've seen, those kind of calls for building back better and what that looks like from the perspective of the North, a big focus on kind of a green transition. And as I've mentioned, there is consensus amongst activists and experts that a green transition is critical for addressing the impacts of the climate crisis, but that central to these proposals for green transition in the global south are the protection of indigenous land rights, investment in the agricultural sector, and the prioritization of food systems as part of the climate mitigation strategy. International tax reform is very important. Expanding social protections and labor market interventions such as investment in green jobs and the legal and economic recognition of work in the informal economy are critical for protecting livelihoods and building resilient economies in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery. But finally, this report has really shown that there are significant gaps in mainstream policy recommendations for economic recovery, particularly how and where these policies position women, the informal economy, and indigenous communities in the functioning of the global economic system. And so therefore, there is a need for alternative visions for a post-COVID-19 economic recovery that are rooted in the experiences of communities and economies in the global south, and that center the role of women and indigenous communities in the structuring of the global economic system. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. What we'll do now is we'll take some questions. All right, we'll take a round of questions. Balance, if you can just alert me if any questions are popping up on the chat, or if there's anybody holding up a hand, and then from the house as well. Take a round. So Laura. All right, I'll throw in one as well. Anybody that's online want to come in? It's quite a nice range of people here. All very welcome. Can you, sir? Okay. I think let's work with that, Laura.
Thanks. Thanks, Siviwe, for a really thorough and massive overview of what we saw in terms of mainstream economic recommendations and the kind of counter recommendations which were coming from below, so to speak. I wondered, though, if you were able to review any kind of sort of alternative macroeconomic framework, i.e. not mainstream, and to what extent those, if you were, to what extent those were able to mirror or pick up on some of the concerns you heard and sort of policy proposals you heard coming from the ground. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Kanyisa?
I just wanted to ask, a great presentation, but I just wanted to ask about if Siviwe doesn't think, it's just more of her opinion, what I should think about, because I feel like the global, especially in Africa, developing countries, there's still a dependency syndrome that we have on, on the West and and also in East Asian countries. So I should not think that an alternative economy would first have to address the dependency syndrome that Africa finds itself in, currently, because a lot, like we don't have self-determination at all. We have to rely on the global north for almost everything, yet we have the resources, we have all of these things. So what I should think about that dependency syndrome, I should not think addressing that may be one step forward into addressing then and envisioning an alternative economy, post-COVID economy in Africa.
Siviwe, let me also just throw in one, and then I think you'll have quite a mouthful. But before I do that, I also just want to do another shout out for the Frederick Urban Stiftung, who is our partner in these events, is funding them. We've worked with them for years. We also partner with them around the Vuyisi Yimini Workers' School, which will be having a big event later in the year. Siviwe is part of the team for that, which we're also very pleased with. Siviwe, I can only echo others that it was a very really nice presentation, clear and to the point and thought-provoking. I guess the thing that I usually throw in here is this question. Proposals are great, but haven't a lot of the left been making these same proposals for about 30 years now? Social dialogue, Keynesian stimulus, but better regulation of labor markets, plugging the leaks on tax. But what happens in every one of these crises is we tend to simply get ruling classes doubling down on neoliberalism. After the global financial crisis, Great Recession, everyone was saying, this is it, this is the end, this time neoliberalism's gone. It intensified. Here again, is something different this time that might potentially get us off the track we are now of more neoliberalism. After all, neoliberalism's been there since the 70s, and we seem to just simply get an extra dose each time. So my thing is a question around feasibility. So if you can chat to those, and then we'll take another round and go from there.
Thanks for all of the very interesting comments and questions. I'll try to speak to them as much as possible. So just to start with Laura's question around alternative economic models and whether I did any work on that. I didn't do any work on that as part of this project, but as you know, with WIGO, we did review kind of alternative economic models. I think it was actually at the start of the pandemic, probably around 2020. So in terms of whether or not those schools of thought, so what is counter to kind of neoliberalism, and we reviewed kind of several ideas around, be it kind of and models, be it circular economy, popular economy. So social democracy, etc. And I would say that a lot of the kind of proposals that were being presented, definitely by activists in the Global South, were more in line with that, more in line with the kind of feminist economic models, models that are more concerned with protecting livelihoods and ensuring that no one really gets left behind. And so when you see kind of proposals around expanding access to social protections, those definitely had more in line of kind of alternatives to that. And a consideration really on how to kind of implement or show that these models are existing and that they do work. So when we think specifically around the idea of a green transition, many of my colleagues here that have worked with informal economy in particular would know that there are a lot of kind of efficiencies in some sectors of the informal economy, waste picking, that are green. They are, I spoke to some colleagues as part of this project of the interview process about the kind of existing jobs and work that people do that are already existing, that are more green, that are not yet being supported. So there are alternatives to that, but whether or not people are able to kind of sustain livelihoods through that really depends, again, to the point of how do we kind of protect workers in these forms of work, but also whether or not there is kind of legal and economic recognition of the kind of work that is already happening within the economy and the kind of efficiencies that these bring in terms of the kind of broader economic landscape. And then to Kanyiso's point on dependencies, so if I understood your question well, it was around, addressing the dependencies. I think I would need for you to kind of, we can have this chat later, for you to expand on what you mean by the dependencies that we need to address before, because you're saying that we should address the dependencies first. But I would argue, the kind of dependencies that, a lot of people would talk about in terms of the global economy are a lot, as I've mentioned, to do with the kind of colonial legacies that are still existing. I talked about the international debt framework. I talked about the kind of tax abuses by the global north. So if there's any dependence, I know we have issues of corruption in South Africa as well, but there is a lot that I think the global north has to be accountable for, especially with the kind of inequality that we've seen historically, but that we're also seeing now in terms of the recovery, that would make us dependent. So I think addressing that unevenness and that inequality is also important now. And then to Lucian's point about the left, Lucian, you're not part of the left. Whether the left goes back, keeps talking about the same issues and the same proposals. I think, I don't know if I would say that that's an issue, really. I think it's important to recognize what the kind of failures of the current economic model are as they happen. I think what is different now with this pandemic is that it seems to have affected a lot of people that would have in other crises had been perhaps unharmed. And we're seeing this exposing the reality of the kind of system that is really, as I said, inadequate for addressing the multiple crises, but it's also inadequate for addressing saving lives, for protecting livelihoods, for even sustaining itself, really. And I think there's an opportunity now with this crisis, with the more that people are, and what it's revealed, to kind of take that opportunity to address those issues. Yes, there's books written about. I have a book right here about the 9 lives of neoliberalism. Capitalism reinvents itself, but I think it's allowed to continue because of our own inaction as well. But I think there are more calls now to support. We can see, especially in South Africa is a good case for this, that where people would have previously, argued against social protections, can see, well, what exactly are people supposed to do in a context where we have rising, unemployment, we have increasing kind of the precariousness of work, but also there's an insufficient access to kind of social protection, social services. So I think more and more people are becoming aware of the need for these, especially with the failing economic system as our own. And what we do, I mean, we've had many moments, and I think the kind of calls for expanded access to social protections is one of them, and potentially one that I think we are closer at achieving because of the pandemic. But yeah, so those are just my scattered thoughts.
Let's take another round. There's one or two things in comments. There is, first of all, some important points about Esther Mhlana, but I think my question is a slightly different one. It's not whether this neoliberalism's got issues or that neoliberalism is unstable. Obviously it is. But as you pointed out in response to Conyuso's emphasis on consciousness as a constraining factor, you pointed to the structural limitations. Part of where I would be coming from, as a different part of the left to this kind of Keynesian stuff, is that the structural conditions for these older types of Keynesian class consensuses aren't there in many countries, for the simple reason that you can't have a domestic stimulus in an open economy without, in many cases, such as South Africa, simply exporting the stimulus to other countries. If, for example, in South Africa did a massive stimulus, people would obviously spend a lot of that, for example, on basic consumer goods, and rightly so. But that will not necessarily create a single job in South Africa, or perhaps it'll create a couple of pairs, while that manufacturing is based in Bangladesh or in China. So while you have a highly open economy, national level demand management policies and modeling around that have got some basic obstacles. That's really where I'm coming from. I'm not trying to sound a pessimist. I like to be the devil's advocate, but all right. Esther says, thanks for such an informative presentation. Your findings show that what we all know, that COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation for the most vulnerable. But a shock for me was that so much of the revenue is lost through tax avoidance, and that was an eye-opening figure. After all, government says there's no money, but apparently there is. You just can't find it. Surely there's something that can be done by the state. She also raised the thing about the UBIC and possible implementation in countries like Nigeria. And here's another crucial thing, which is partly a structural thing. What can civil society do to put pressure on government to implement this? I mean, government is right now revising the criteria for UBIC. And it's looking like it wants to roll it out. In fact, I'm pretty sure it would have to roll it out if they didn't have the ANC's national conference coming up. I think they want to kick that can down the road. So let's take taking Esther as part of that. So I think there are two questions there. David, anybody also online who's got any comments type or raise a hand? And Laura's got to come back. Yeah, and you said too. Okay, David.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on your point. When you say Keynesianism is no longer possible in an open economy, what is possible in an open economy?
It's called neoliberalism.
That in the absence of multilateralism, right? Yet we are so constrained. And I suppose what Siviwe is saying is that it's really interesting that these things are becoming mainstreamed on the left. Yeah? So the left are no longer saying social policy is just about wiping babies' bottom. The left was very rude about social policy, right? The left
Depends
has
which
become, the left
left,
has
yeah.
become social democratic, right?
No, social democrats.
It hates to admit that it has become social democratic. And the IMF and the World Bank have also grudgingly moved away from hard neoliberalism. And we mustn't pretend that Europe is monolithically neoliberal, right? The point is,
Good point.
otherwise we have no agency on the left. We're saying should, like we should have a just green transition, but who's going to do it? Not the people in the townships and in Amazon, right? It's not. So what is this agency? And I think what you need to talk about is, you mentioned partnerships. So that's what's really interesting there. How are we going to get political agency? At what level? What's possible at the national level, or as Lucian said, isn't possible because if we have a stimulus, what is just going to be lost into imports? Or is it? What is possible in terms of social policy nationally? And I'm following up on the civil society point. Is how can civil society and left politics pressurize the mainstreaming of these ideas? We see in the US now, there's an election coming up and they can't even organize themselves to defend abortion rights. So everybody's, but getting people out to vote, it looks like the Republicans are going to get into Congress, right? So, the agency is the thing that really bothers me. How we can say should, ought to, and we can all agree that it's bad, right? But what is the agency? So that's the really interesting question. That I think it's the agency follows from having the right policies, where at least rationally there should be consensus. But there isn't because of the way the electorates are working at the moment. You've got people voting for Trump and supporting Putin. Anyway, so I think the agency thing is really the thing that's so.
Thanks, I just see another thing, questions from Mike. Great presentations. We have perhaps a variation on Lucian's question. There are constraints of our current structure. We usually greater side for optimism, which I think is quite nice. Greater side for optimism. Where do you think it might be? Are you leaning towards gains in social protection or opening up new policy spaces? So there's some things from Mike and Laura.
I'm going to leave my question because it might be a bit of a downer on Siviwe's answer to this question. So I think
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah.
Okay. Siviwe, floor, so to speak, is yours again.
Well, thank you for all of your comments. I actually wish I was in the room so we can have this discussion. And obviously then we wouldn't have any, we'd have less time constraints as well. But yeah, to Esther's point about the civil society and what can civil society do to put pressure on government. Well, there are a lot of organizations in response to that are already pushing for some of these things. And I think I might just combine my response with Mike's question. I do think that there is a big opportunity in terms of social protection. But again, as David mentions, we still aren't exactly clear on, what that would look like. It's still, there's still debates around is that in terms of universal basic income grant, but certainly what we're seeing more and more is that there is a need for improving access to social services, but also in the protections of workers. So for me, I definitely would say that there is opportunity with that. What happens then, or what are the opportunities for civil society, or what can civil society do? I think, or for me, it would be important to go back again in the history of South African politics. And a lot of my comrades and colleagues that are in this room can think about how this moment has changed and how activism and organizing has changed in South Africa. I've had conversations where really there is concern around how the left civil society has become so removed from the people that it claims to be representing. And one of our challenges is that you can't build a critical mass just being based, in spaces that are primarily middle class, like academia, right? But I know that especially the kind of issues that we're talking to are supposed to be issues that would drive the kind of mass support, for social protection. This is something that is affecting a large majority of South Africans. We see this in terms of even with the issue of jobs in South Africa, that there's a large, there is a big concern. And I think, the issue of jobs, I as Lucian mentioned, part of my MA was around work in South Africa and how in the post-apartheid period that's been changing. Issue of unemployment is something that's been a big challenge in South Africa. But what I think was highlighted by the pandemic, and especially with the kind of lockdowns and shutdowns, was the fact that people really did not have either access to social protection or even access to alternative ways of sustaining themselves and their livelihoods. So there is an opportunity here, but whether or not, that is linked to the, communities and society itself, and where now the left and civil society factor in terms of kind of the political landscape of South Africa as well, is something that I think is important. I know there's a lot of work that is being done right now, especially around this kind of social protection debate, and following what, the kinds of proposals that are being pushed out by the government and holding people accountable. I think South Africa is at least, it definitely is a neoliberal country, but our government likes to present itself, I would say, as this government that is concerned. Our president will be concerned about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, while there's corruption and we're losing money that is supposed to be intended at supporting people. But I think playing on that, that is where the opportunity is for civil society to play on the fact that it is supposed to be different to what we understand, perhaps, high income capitalist countries to be. I don't think there is room to ignore the masses that are affected by the pandemic, but also the masses that have been historically affected by the multiple crises, as I said, that have been highlighted by this pandemic. But definitely, if I were to say, in terms of just my own observations, there is an opportunity in social protection. But yeah. I don't know if there's any other questions.
Yeah, we'll just take one more. But again, it would be nice if you were here, because then we could probably talk to these issues for many hours. And I think we all face that dilemma, right? That we can see what the problem is and probably what the cure is, but we don't know how to put the two things together. And the people who are around the world making a lot of the running are the right. I don't know if in the Philippines, Marcos, the son of an infamous dictator, has won the elections. And it's not simply a case that everything the far right does just talks about immigration. It actually does speak to that anger of people that feel the elites have thrown them out. And people are completely correct. Most elites don't give a damn. They really don't. I wanted to just use this to highlight, and I've put a picture in the chat box. For more discussion on this theme, ILRIC is hosting an event on Saturday at NMU at the Mission Vale campus, NMU. Mission Vale campus this Saturday, 10 to 1:30. It's a Rojava Revolution Youth Tour. And they've got some people out from the Rojava zone in Syria who quote, shared experience of revolution, democratic confederalism, building a community economy, and youth movement. So these are important conversations, and we should never dismiss even the importance of talking about them. I've noted Coniso, you got a hand, and Laura, are you coming back with a question? David's going.
Sorry,
No,
thank you very much. Thank you.
David says cheers. Okay. And
You've just recently talked about unemployment. Where does youth unemployment fit in? Because social protection and the big are, they're stopgap solutions. They are not going to work in the long term. Social protection, of course, social pensions, they have to be there. But otherwise, it's an alternative to employment. And I'm sure youth aspire to work rather than to be grant recipients.
Yeah.
And would the green economy absorb more youth, or in your presentation, you talked a lot about the reset might include a just green economy.
I don't know if you heard all of that, but essentially Valerie was asking, what about jobs? Because ultimately that's where a lot of sustainable solutions are going to be. And does this green transition, just or otherwise, does it seem to have scope for jobs? I mean, this is actually why a lot of unions are very ambivalent about it, because what they think of is closed down mines, closed down factories. I noted, and I'm sorry, I didn't see him earlier. I'm just going to put him on the list quickly. Gillard. I think let's Gillard, if you want to just speak your question, and then I'll come to the other people in the room.
Hi, excellent. Thanks very much. And I think this is really, really interesting work, an important area. I think the question of, the ongoing forces of neoliberalism and what, the point that was raised around, sorry, I'm not sure who it was, not being able to see everyone, which is what's like different like this time. And, aren't we just going to be faced with, we've like known about these problems for like a while, and aren't we faced with the same pushback? I'm sorry if I'm bastardizing that input, but I mean, I do think it raises, and we at IEJ are actively working on many of the issues which like Siviwe speaks to. And I do think it raises an important point. It raises an important question of what is structurally different now to a decade ago or two, or in the 80s and 90s with like structural adjustment programs, and what does that mean for the left and for organizing around this? And I would be interested with colleagues to think a bit more deeply about this. There are a few things which come to mind, but a provisional. The first is that there's a schism in macroeconomic policy thinking that's emerged in the wake of COVID, with the global north actively pursuing policies which don't fit within a neoliberal the toolkit, huge expansionary and interventionist policies which recenter the role of the state in a moment of crisis. That's threatened by the inflation mania which we see now, but is quite profound, I think, and different fundamentally to what we saw after 2008. But there's a polarization where that's not what's being pushed in Global South and in African countries. If you look at Oxfam's work on the use of IFI COVID loans for austerity, it is widespread. Okay, so there's a question there of how one in the global south taps into a different policy agenda that's actually been implemented in global north countries. I think there is a different level of mobilization in civil society and in activist organizations in global south countries now to what there was in a decade ago or more. These issues of macroeconomic policy and how that influences rights realization, the climate, decent work, and so on, is very, very much more on people's radar. There's very much more sense of the macroeconomies and its impact. There's a new rhetoric. There is a global north rhetoric of tax the rich and so on, which can also be kind of plugged into, which also didn't exist really in the 2000s in the same way. There's a question of whether we're in a unipolar or like a multipolar world. I think that's a complex and difficult question, but I think there's questions we need to ask ourselves about the role of China and other large global south countries. And then lastly, there's the existential threat of climate change, which is mobilizing macroeconomic policy in new ways. If you look at central bank policies, okay, it is problematic in many respects, but you've got the ECB and others talking actively about the use of monetary policy in a far more interventionist way than previously. And I guess that provides another opportunity. So I agree that we face a potential problem of, okay, we like know about this, we've always known about this, what do we do? But these are just some sort of thoughts on I think some things which could make this moment different. Lastly, I know I've gone on for a while. The question of labor unions in this is crucial, and certain global south countries, and South Africa being one of them, have catch up to play here, which I think is happening. We've worked with COSATU, for instance, on climate change work, but yeah, I think there is a coming together in parts of the world of a labor environment, activist, social rights movements in a more coherent sense around some of these issues than there was previously. But yeah, I'd also be keen to analyze the conjuncture a bit more in understanding whether or not the opportunities for alternative futures is more or less available.
And I think Gillard just reminds us that there's a lot of flux going on at the moment. If I'm not mistaken, Trump's initial stimulus, they spent more than the entire combined GDP of the African continent. It's sort of back of the envelope calculation. So a lot depends on also what's possible in different contexts. I mean, South Africa could roll out a modest quasi-UBIC, which is simply not an option for a lot of countries like most of them. So I think those national dynamics are also important. Anissa, I know you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, no, I think it's more to basically piggyback on what my colleague was saying.
Valerie.
Yes. And I think she was right when she was saying, basically you can give people this unemployment grant, but then that's more like putting a bandage to a broken leg. Because what's happening in South Africa, I think the government, and I think there's a lot of lazy thinking in the government in terms of how do you actually deal with this excess population, whereby you get a matric pass rate with a matric pass, which is like, I think 35%, yeah. And then you get now an economy which is not absorbing a lot of the people into work. So you get a growing number of people who are not in education, employment, training. So now it's a ticking time bomb. So the government doesn't know what to do with this growing population of low-skilled, uneducated people, you see? And I think that goes to the fact that the anti-colonial movement, the liberation movement, I think obviously had a dual purpose. It was to political independence, but also for economic independence and economic redress. And I think obviously the political part has been, achieved, but economically, I think the politicians or policymakers haven't gone into actually rethinking what the problem really is. When I said to Siviwe dependency, I meant that because countries like South Africa were set up as sites of extraction, you see, and so the policies still remain outward looking, and we still remain dependent on foreign capital, on foreign markets, and on foreign aid. So as I was saying, the government doesn't really think of policies to address how you break that dependency by actually industrializing and creating factories and making our own cars, making our own cell phones, making even the most product that need very limited technology, you see. But as you said, we're importing a lot of these things. So we're basically importing jobs or exporting jobs, I guess. So the government doesn't know what to do with this excess population. And I feel like this UBIC or this grant is literally just putting a bandage on a broken leg. I think more difficult questions need to be asked, you see, in terms of how do we actually get people to work, as you're saying. And the only way you can do that is you need to start creating an industrial base. And apartheid, as much as it does have bad policies, they were already trying to kind of create, they had a manufacturing base, they had all of these things. So I think the government needs to start thinking of questions like that, of, industrializing. And people will say, no, the reason why we are importing stuff because they have lower production costs and lower labor. So we might need to start thinking along those lines, but then the government, then the subsidies go to those low wage workers then. You see, so to meet that shortfall. So you're beating them at the low wage, you're beating Asia with their low wage regime. However, then you subsidize those low wage workers here in South Africa and meet the shortfall so that they're employed instead of just giving people 350 Rand and the population is growing. What's going to happen? It's going to implode at some point.
No, thanks, Connie.
So that's a comment, basically.
No, that's great. And I think one of what this particular seminar has brought together very nicely is a range of perspectives, sparking ideas, and I think we're all learning something here. I think the contrast people are drawing between past and present in a range of ways also incredibly instructive. Laura, just want to come?
Yeah, just maybe two.
And this will be the last one, and then we allow Siviwe to wrap up.
Just two quick comments. I mean, one that I've noticed working at Vivo is the real animation around the social and solidarity economy. So after this crisis and the loss of livelihoods, organizations, first-world workers coming together and say, we actually can't rely on the state to do it for us. We're going to have to do it for ourselves. And part of this is about coming together and forming, alternative worker-owned forms of economic activities. And for the first time this year at the International Labour Conference, the discussion will focus on the social and solidarity economy, which is quite interesting for the ILO to move in that direction, to be honest. So, I would say that's another potential opportunity. I think there are real opportunities and limits with the social and solidarity economy discussions. That's one we can talk about as an entire other seminar. But I think that's another sort of thing along with social protection that has raised itself. And just a quick one on social protection. Siviwe is quite right to say that it's a moment for social protection, and I know because I work in that space and I'm run off my feet. But I think it's also a moment to be careful about what kind of social protection we are advocating for, because there are ways to be adversely incorporated into social protection systems as well. And it's something to watch quite carefully. Digitization of social protection systems has happened under COVID at rapid pace. That is huge amounts of money going to private companies and to digitizing the state in a way that the left is still trying to catch up with as we speak. Financialization goes along with that as well. What are the opportunities and threats of all of this for society. So I think there's lots of things about social protection, like when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, that we have to be careful about as well. So that was just an addition. Thanks.
Thanks. Siviwe, we'll hand over to you just to say the last chunk. I wasn't going to say the last word because there's no way you could deal with this with a word.
Thank you all, and I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. I think just so that we don't forget Valerie's point, because she did raise an important point around unemployment and the issue of jobs. I think when I speak, and I'm sure that my colleagues here also share the same, that when talking about the need for expanding kind of access to social protections, that's not happening in isolation of the, kind of, and awareness of the issue of jobs in South Africa. And I do believe that there is room within these concepts that call for obviously green transition as well. As you suggested, there is room for that in terms of addressing a lot of issues around youth unemployment in particular. I will say that from what I've observed from the kind of policy proposals, national policy proposals around youth employment have really been around this concept of digitalization and not many kind of proposals around what it would mean in terms of green jobs. But there are suggestions, as I've said, from the Global South in terms of the kinds of jobs that already exist and how to support that. But I do think that these things can happen at the same time. We can think about jobs and we can think about social protection, but also in thinking about jobs, we also have to be very aware of what we mean and what kinds of jobs we're talking about. I don't share the belief that a job is a job and it's good no matter what. As we've seen with the kind of rising precariousness of work, that there's a lot of insecurity and instability, and the kinds of jobs that people are already working in are not jobs that can enable a decent life and a decent livelihood. So in thinking about those kind of jobs going forward, I think we need to think about that. But we also do need to think about jobs in the context of what is happening in terms of climate change, what is happening in terms of just the world of work, and whether or not some jobs have been completely transformed by the COVID-19 pandemic. But I definitely think that we do need to think about jobs, but we also need to think about social protection and social protection in the context of the types of jobs that a lot of people in the Global South are engaged in, and the kinds of supports that would be required. So, yeah.
We'll give a round of applause. Not the same when we blended. That was awesome. I want to just mention that all of these talks are recorded, and we've got a system now where we're uploading talks, so we'll share that, because I think there's a lot of other people who would also love to hear this. So thank you so much. With that, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. Thanks again to FES for funding this. Thank you to all the comrades and colleagues who made this possible. Big shout out to Valence, to Nande, for all of their hard work, but Siviwe, most of all to you. Thank you. Thank you very much.